In my trusty New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, which I like to ascribe to, there is a line, the line in question, that reads, "In my Father's house there are many dwelling places." Dwelling places. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? Dwelling places never really did it for me. So many of us grew up on the King James Version. But before I get to that, oh, yes, the King James Version that so many of us are familiar with. "In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, would I have told you I go to prepare a place for you." Mansions. Well, as a young upstart seminarian, I would have told you that many years ago that that's a total inappropriate interpretation of the text. And as you heard from Jim in the version he read today, another attempt to find it. But in chatting with Jim, who is as close to a Bible scholar as I have in my life, he said this morning, we were at breakfast together, actually mansions is probably the very, very best word. So we'll talk a little bit about why that might be the best word. My childhood living Bible, which I like to go back to draw up my own experiences from childhood, says there are many homes there where my Father lives, like it's a subdivision. There are many homes popping up in heaven. Then the New International Version moves it so you can be a landlord or a landlady. My Father's house has many rooms. Then always it's good in this day and age to go to Eugene Peterson's Message, and he just makes it nice, big, and broad. There's plenty of room for you in my Father's home. In whatever version, I just love this line. I can't get enough of it. I wish it were read more often than just at memorial and funeral services, although they are powerful words, beautiful lyrical words, and a very reassuring text to read when someone is mourning the loss of a loved one. There's something so comforting in the thought of heaven being constituted as one big old residential street with more than enough room for all of us. If you take the King James interpretation, which is still the one choice for poetry and imagination, then every single one of us has a mansion in the sky. It reminds me of a joke. A joke about a very wealthy man who had died and gone to heaven. God bless his soul. As he's getting his welcoming tour from St. Peter, they walk down a street and he sees his housekeeper, Mavis, who preceded him in death. She is sitting comfortably on the porch of a most exquisite, opulent, gigantic mansion. She sees her former employer and waves and smiles a big smile, and he waves and smiles back. As they walk away, the man says to his host, "Well, if that's what they provide up here for my housekeeper, I can only imagine what's ready for me." As they rounded the corner, St. Peter and the man came up upon an old rickety shack, barely fit for beasts to live in, much less human being. St. Peter stopped in front of it and motioned as if they were to go inside. The man, looking very confused, questioned St. Peter, "Whose home would this be for eternity?" St. Peter indicated, "Yours." "How can this be?" he sputtered and fumed. "You've given my lowly housekeeper Mavis a mansion beyond compare. And I, who made 10, 20, 30 times her salary in my life, you've given me a filthy shack. How can this be?" St. Peter quietly replied, "Well, sir, we only use the resources you send ahead." But if you move beyond the specific image of a mansion to the idea that there's lots of rooms, and a great big household of God, then you begin to echo some of the wording. The word for this household is oiko, oiko in Greek, from which we get our word ecumenical. When we're talking about all the different churches, when we get together, we have an ecumenical gathering. It means the household of God, which I just love, which is to say, no one of us is the sum total of the household of God. There's an old joke that Covenant players used to tell. When I saw them many years ago, Covenant Players was a church theater group. And they would be walking along and laughing and talking, and clearly they're up in heaven. And the angel there that's giving the tour would say, yeah, over there, those are the Presbyterians. Hi! Oh. There's the Baptist. Hey, Baptist! And then suddenly the angel says, shh, be very quiet and kneel down. And as they go past the wall, one of them finally says, why are we doing this? The angel says, that's the disciples of Christ. They don't think anybody else is up here. The whole household of God, the ecumenikos, the oikos. That is the household that Jesus is talking about in this prayer. It's inviting us to imagine up in heaven a large house where every child gets her or his own room. Isn't that a big deal for young, growing families? I know it was a deal in our house. Was it a deal in your house? Have you had to share your room with one or two or three? How many of you all had to share your childhood room with one other? How many of you had to share with two other? Any people had to share with three, meaning there's four in a room? Okay. Four, which means there was five of you in a room? Okay, still. Six? Going? 7? 8? So you understand, having your own room is a big deal. I haven't thought much about it now, but thinking now about my father, who was finishing his military career and having this house built in Roswell, New Mexico, he had, in addition to he and my mother's room, and a room for the newborn brother, Pat, he had 2 other rooms built for his now adopted stepchildren, my older brother and sister. He had a house that he made sure that these 2 children who were not his own would always have their own room to come home to. Now, I'd like to say that they always came home to that room to live in peace and harmony. But my brother and sister did not, but that's okay. They had their own room to slam the doors with. I love the fact that Dad had that desire and, admittedly, the financial resources to make a place for the whole family to feel at home. Over time, those 2 rooms would house so many other people in my lifetime. My grandmother had to come live with us and lived with us till she died. My brother Pat had a best friend whose home life was very, very terrible and came and lived in one of those rooms. I was angry about that as a child. I think it's close to saintliness now as an adult. But that's the kind of feeling that I think when we hear that the word that is expressed to us, there are many mansions in my Father's house. There's plenty of room in my Father's house, in God's house for all of us. In Abba, Mama, God's house, there's always room for just one more child. In the heavenly household of God, you will always find a room available. There's no vacancy sign. There's always a light on the porch. As Jesus was talking to his disciples on that fateful night, after they had been humbled with their master washing their feet, after they had been confused by this ritual of bread and cup being shared, After Judas had slipped out into the cold night to complete his painfully tortured deal, Jesus tries his best in the Gospel of John to ease the disciples into knowing he was going. And what do you do but speak in poetry and metaphor? It would be a natural thing to talk about a mansion in the sky. And lest we think this lectionary text is woefully out of place after Easter, shouldn't this be before Easter when we're preparing for Maundy Thursday and Passion Week? Lest we think that, we need to look more closely, because John and really all the evangelists realized that there were two goodbyes that Jesus had to have. One was helping the disciples understand that his earthly, physical body was going to be going. And that's what happened that Passion Week and all those conversations he had with them. But once resurrected, he needed to remind them that he wasn't going to be there forever in that form either. And needed to allow them the grace of knowing a second goodbye was going to happen. How many of us have the time in our earthly life to help our family members prepare for our leaving? It's an unusual and a grace-filled human being that has the forethought to think about that. The second goodbye between Easter and Pentecost, Jesus is priming his followers for his ascension into heaven, for the second goodbye. But what he's also reminding them in this passage is that he's not just leaving them, but he's empowering them to do bigger and better things, greater things. And isn't that what our loved ones want from us? Not for us to be crippled by their death, not for us to be destroyed by their passing, but to be enlivened, enriched, made better. And so Jesus says, very truly I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these. Greater works than Jesus is what we're gifted in this second goodbye. Now I realize that this understanding of housing in heaven is very different in our world, in our blood, sweat, tears, bricks, and mortar world. That's actually the sad backstory of the joke I told you. Because just being a good person, even a very faithful Christian, doesn't ensure someone is going to have a roof over their heads. It doesn't ensure that someone will have a safe place to lay down at night. Housing on this side of paradise is a complex equation which includes family history and politics. Those things we don't like to talk about, like race and class and gender, economics, neighborhood forces, whether or not you have a block club, politics that are national and global. Craig and I went recently to see a play called Clybourne Park at Playhouse Square. It's a wonderful play. It got the Pulitzer, and it's a reimagined next story or next chapter to Lorraine Hansberry's famous Raisin in the Sun. You remember in Raisin in the Sun, this African-American family in the 50s came into an inheritance, and the father wants to buy a beautiful new home and chooses an all-white neighborhood in which to buy the home. And it's all the family dynamics and the real estate agent who comes to try and talk him out of that. Well, Clybourne Park is the white family in their home who are selling to the black family. And all the dynamics going on with their neighbors saying, you're doing what? What's beautiful about this particular play, and I'm probably going into too much detail, is that it shifts 50 years later, and now that neighborhood has become all black. And gentrification is getting to set in, and of all the ironies, the white families want to come back in and buy the house back because it's the happening, cool, hip neighborhood. Only they want to tear down this house that has all this rich history and build a bigger and better one, and that's the dynamic of that. That's housing on this side of paradise. And we have quickly forgotten the not-too-distant mortgage crisis, where well-meaning, fully employed people discovered homes shuttered and their life's belongings on the tree lawn. So this brings me, oddly enough, to Eileen Kotick. Most of us here in the church met Eileen and Ron, as I said before, when they came to Cleveland to say goodbye to their mother, Eleanor Kieran. And to do as so many of us have done, manage her affairs and dispose of her contents of her household. Having done this myself, and having been with so many of you who have done this, I can easily imagine Ron and Eileen doing that first walkthrough in that house, thinking, how can we ever get through this? And I just love the fact that these intrepid adventurers not only managed to get through Eleanor's life belongings, but thought very carefully about how to gift those so they would be repurposed and have a new life. And so many things coming through this congregation that Eleanor had loved and Eileen and Ron came to love. In fact, this is where their story begins to sound a bit like what Jesus was talking about. For you see, Eleanor and Ron chose not to see that house as simply theirs to do with as they please, but a treasure to be shared with the community. They saw the larger community of God connected to that house. In their grief, they would have had every right to just think about getting through it as quickly as possible, but they did not. Month after month, they would come back and then do as much as they could and go back to Alaska. And then they would come back. We began to anticipate and be excited about when we would hear that Ron and Eileen were coming back. They didn't ask how Eleanor's stuff could be disposed of. They asked the very simple question, who would benefit from Eleanor's things? Who would find her beautiful cards and stationery helpful to have to write their own letters and notes? Clothes ended up on our disciples' closet rack for distribution. This piece of furniture or that household item were noted to church staff who would scramble then to try and find someone who needed an end table or who needed whatever he brought or they brought. On several visits, this bond began to form between Eileen and Ron and this church, and they began to think of us as another home in their constellation of home. That was a beautiful, beautiful experience. I think Eileen and Ron were trying to live out in this earthly life what Jesus was pointing to should happen in our eternal life. How can we make a dwelling place for every child of God in the here and now so that we will find true comfort in our dwelling place when we arrive there? Can we have, rather than be walled off by fear and gated by guardedness, how can we make accessible and affordable to more of the people of God a safe place to lay their head and call home? Can we live as good neighbors in the here and now so that having rehearsed it so well, when we get to the then and there, the by and by, we might actually behave well as neighbors with whoever is up there, even the Presbyterians. Whether it is through political action and policy change, through just being a good neighbor and community organizing, or through sharing our resources through benevolences and charity, we can assure that more and more of God's children have a safe place to call home in God's household here on earth. And if we live more giving lives like Eileen Kotick did, we will coincidentally, I think, be sending pretty ample supplies up there for our own eternal comfort and peace. I'm not certain, but I think that's kind of what Jesus was saying. I'm willing to give it a try. And so to conclude this sermon, I wanted to say to Ron, I have on pretty good authority that Eileen is living in one sweet mansion, and she has tons of room for all of us when that time comes. Thanks be to God. Amen. So as we conclude our service, let us stand as we are able and commit ourselves to being part of the household of God. If you are looking for a place to call church home, if you would like to give your life to Jesus Christ, please come forward while we all stand and sing.
Our hymn of invitation is number 275.